This video reviews Section B of the 2020 Election Administration and Voting Survey, or EVES. This section seeks to understand voters covered under the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, or UOCAVA. You can find similar presentations for the other 5 sections of the survey on the EVES portal and the Election Assistance Commission website. Section B is the result of a partnership between the Election Assistance Commission and the Federal Voting Assistance Program to collect, share, and evaluate data on the voting experiences of citizens covered under UOCAVA. These questions are being asked in a single survey to reduce the data collection burden on local election officials, while still allowing both agencies to fulfill their congressionally mandated requirements to study UOCAVA voters. As you watch this video, you might want to follow along with the PDF version of the survey, which can be found on the Downloads page of the EVES portal. Section B of EVES asks for the following information about UOCAVA voters in the 2020 election. First, how many voters in your jurisdiction were registered as UOCAVA voters? Second, how many federal postcard applications, or FPCAs, were received, accepted, and rejected? Third, how many ballots were transmitted to UOCAVA voters? How many were returned? And of the returned ballots, how many were counted and how many were rejected? And finally, how many federal write-in absentee ballots, or FWABs, did your office receive, accept, and reject? Before we begin discussing the questions in Section B, there are some important definitions to know. UOCAVA covers several populations, but there are 2 groups of voters you will be asked about in EVES. First, Uniformed Services voters. These are members of the United States Armed Forces, the Merchant Marine, and the Commissioned Corps of the Public Health Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who are away from their place of residence. In addition, the eligible spouses and dependents of those Uniformed Services voters are also considered Uniformed Services voters. These Uniformed Services voters and their family members may be residing domestically or overseas, but if they're absent from the place of residence where they're eligible to vote, they are covered by UOCAVA and are counted as Uniformed Services voters. The second group of UOCAVA voters is non-military and civilian U.S. citizens living overseas. This distinction is important to remember because most questions in Section B will ask you to divide the totals you report into these 2 categories. When you do this, the number of Uniformed Services voters and civilian overseas voters should sum to the total count that you report. Again, please remember to count family members of active duty military or Merchant Marine members as Uniformed Services voters when you report your data. If your state or jurisdiction doesn't collect the data to distinguish between Uniformed Services and civilian overseas UOCAVA voters, you will report data not available in the relevant question. Some states cover additional categories of voters under UOCAVA, such as National Guard members who are activated on state orders. If your state allows other populations to register as UOCAVA voters, they should be included in the data you report in Section B. Some states also have a form other than FPCAs that voters can use to register as UOCAVA voters. Individuals who use these state forms are considered UOCAVA voters for purposes of EVES. However, questions B2 through B4 ask specifically about FPCAs, and UOCAVA voters who used other registration forms should not be included in these questions. Next, let's discuss the types of UOCAVA absentee ballots you'll be reporting. Here again, there are 2 categories. The first is a transmitted ballot, which is a ballot your election office sends to a voter. They can be transmitted through the postal mail, through email, or by fax. but what makes it a transmitted ballot is that it originated from the election office. Data on transmitted ballots will be reported in questions B5 through B22. Federal write-in absentee ballots, or FWABs, on the other hand, originate from voters. UOCAVA voters may send FWABs if their requested absentee ballot doesn't arrive in time. Once again, FWABs can be sent to your office through several methods, but these FWABs originate from the voter, not from the election office. Data on FWABs will be reported only in questions B23 through B27. When you're reporting data about UOCAVA ballots, your office transmitted, received, and counted in questions B5 through B22. Do not include any FWABs in what you report. With those definitions in mind, let's review the questions in Section B. The first data you'll provide is the total number of voters in your jurisdiction who were registered eligible UOCAVA voters in the November 2020 general election. This will be reported in B1A. Next, you'll divide that total into Uniformed Services voters and Civilian Overseas voters in B1B and B1C. The sum of B1B and B1C should match the total you reported in B1A. Report data not available if you cannot distinguish between types of UOCAVA voters. If your jurisdiction didn't have any UOCAVA eligible voters in this election, then you will enter 0 as your answer to B1A, B1B, and B1C. The next group of questions asks about FPCAs. These are applications UOCAVA eligible voters can use to request an absentee ballot for a federal election. As we discussed previously, this question applies only to FPCAs, not to other methods UOCAVA voters can use to register or request ballots. In question B2, you'll report the total number of FPCAs you received for the 2020 general election. B3 and B4 ask how many of those FPCAs were rejected. FPCAs rejected because they didn't meet eligibility requirements. For instance, because they lacked signatures or weren't from an eligible UOCAVA voter, will be reported in B3. FPCAs rejected because they were received after the deadline will be reported in B4. Note that questions B2 and B3 ask you to separate the totals out by the type of UOCAVA voter, but you don't need to do this in question B4. The next part of Section B asks about UOCAVA ballots transmitted to voters. As a reminder, this doesn't include FWABs or other ballots that weren't initiated by the election office. First, in question B5, you'll report the total number of absentee ballots transmitted to UOCAVA voters. Then, in B6, B7, and B8, you'll report how many of those ballots were transmitted by postal mail, by email, and by other modes. The other modes you report in B8 may include fax, online ballot delivery portals, or any other method your state uses aside from postal mail and email. If your state does not transmit ballots by one of the modes listed in the question, you will report does not apply for that question. All 4 of these questions will have you separate out Uniformed Services voters and Civilian Overseas voters. If your jurisdiction didn't transmit any UOCAVA ballots to voters in the 2020 election, then report 0 for B5A and skip to question B23. The next set of questions applies to transmitted UOCAVA ballots that voters returned to the election office, regardless of whether the ballot was ultimately counted. Once again, this does not include FWABs. You'll notice that this question set is structured very similarly to B5 through B8. For this set of questions, B9 asks for the total number of ballots returned, B10 asks about ballots returned by postal mail, B11 asks about ballots returned by email, and B12 asks about ballots returned by other modes. such as fax or online ballot delivery portals. Once more, you'll report uniformed services voters and civilian overseas voters separately in addition to the totals. Some UOCAVA ballots your jurisdiction sends may be returned as undeliverable. The mailing address or email address may have been incorrect, or the ballot was sent to a bad fax number. These undeliverable ballots will be reported in question B13. You'll report the total undeliverable ballots in B13A, report undeliverable ballots sent by postal mail in B13B, report undeliverable ballots sent by email in B13C, and report undeliverable ballots sent by other modes in B13D. For this question, you do not have to report by uniformed or civilian UOCAVA voters. If a ballot cannot be returned by one of the listed modes, you will report does not apply in that question. Next, in questions B14 through B17, you'll report on UOCAVA ballots that were returned by voters and counted in the November 2020 election. Just as with previous questions, B14 collects data on the total number of UOCAVA ballots counted. B15 collects data on counted ballots that were returned by mail. B16 collects data on counted ballots that were returned by email. And B17 collects data on counted ballots that were returned by other modes, such as fax or online ballot delivery portals. You will report the totals in the A sub-items. Then report the numbers for uniformed services voters in the B sub-items, and for non-military or civilian overseas voters in the C sub-items. The final set of UOCAVA ballot questions is about ballots that were returned by voters and ultimately rejected. The total number of these ballots will be reported in B18. Rather than breaking down the totals by method of transmission, instead, you will break down the data according to why the ballots were rejected. Ballots received after the deadline will be reported in B19. Ballots with a signature problem will be reported in B20. Ballots without a postmark will be reported in B21. And ballots rejected for all other reasons will be reported in B22. In addition to reporting the totals for these rejection reasons, you'll break the totals out into uniformed services voters and civilian overseas voters. The final set of questions in Section B is about FWABs. Only FWABs, not any other UOCAVA absentee ballot, should be recorded in these questions. As with previous question sets, you'll report the total number of FWABs returned in B23. Report the number of FWABs that were counted in B24, and use the rest of the questions to report data on why the FWABs were rejected. FWABs that were rejected for being received too late will be recorded in B25. FWABs rejected because the voter's regular absentee ballot was received and counted will be recorded in B26. And FWABs rejected for any other reason will be recorded in B27. Also, like previous questions, you'll report the number of uniformed services voters and civilian overseas voters in each category in addition to the total numbers. Many of the questions in Section B require you to report regular UOCAVA ballots separately from FWABs. Not all states and jurisdictions are able to do that. If you cannot, then you should report data not available for the survey questions where you cannot separate the two types of ballots, and instead report the data in the comments for each question. For instance, if you could not tell whether a return ballot was a regular UOCAVA ballot or a FWAB, then you would report data not available for items B9A through B12C, and for items B23A through C. Then, in the comments box for questions B9 through B12, you would write the number of total ballots you received and report how many of them were from uniformed services voters and how many were from civilian voters. In the comments box for questions B23 through B26, you would note that you recorded data on received FWABs in an earlier comment. When recording data in the comments of Section B, please do your best to provide all the breakdowns the questions ask for, including breakdowns of uniformed services voters versus civilian voters, and breakdowns of the mode by which the ballots were transmitted or received. Doing this will allow the EAC to accurately analyze and report your data. We appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. We encourage you to carefully read through each section before answering any of the questions to ensure you're accurately reporting your data. A PDF of all EVES questions is on the Downloads page of the EVES portal. We also encourage you to use the comment boxes for each question to provide us with additional information and context. This will help us analyze and report your data accurately. If you need additional assistance, please don't hesitate to contact us at eavs@forsmarshgroup.com. All emails sent to that address will be answered within 1 business day. Thank you, and we appreciate your time and your contributions to the 2020 EVES.